So, eyewitness reports are incomplete, unreliable, partially constructed, and can be manipulated. Can we improve them? Let's start with something controversial: forensic hypnosis. Hypnosis is a process in which people are guided to place themselves in an altered state of consciousness. It's argued that in this altered state, individuals have heightened focus and concentration, allowing them to potentially concentrate better on a specific thought or memory. In this state, people also appear to be particularly open to suggestion. The FBI, New York police, Texan police, and the Israeli police, amongst others, have all used hypnosis to improve eyewitness recall. Forensic hypnosis has been reported to be useful, especially when the witness experiences trauma from the crime they observed. To illustrate this, let's look at a couple of crimes where forensic hypnosis was key in catching the suspect, as reported in an article by Marilyn Smith of the University of Toronto. The first example is known as the Chowchilla kidnapping case. In July of 1976, 26 Californian school children and their bus driver were abducted at gunpoint, herded into vans and were driven to a quarry where they were put into a cave and the entrance sealed. Eventually, they managed to dig their way out and escape. However, when the bus driver was questioned by police, his recall of events was sketchy. He had seen and tried to memorize 2 of the van license plate numbers, but had been too frightened to concentrate under the constant surveillance of the kidnappers. Under hypnosis, it was suggested to the driver that he imagine himself sitting in his favorite chair watching the events unfold as if he was watching a documentary on TV. In this state, he called out 2 license plate numbers, and one of these numbers, with the exception of a single digit, turned out to be the license plates of one of the vans driven by the kidnappers. This led to their arrest after one of the biggest manhunts in Californian history. That is, the use of forensic hypnosis was credited with capturing the criminals when all other leads had failed. In a second example, 2 girls aged 7 and 15 were kidnapped by a man from the San Francisco area. He told them that the doors of his car were wired with explosives, which he would trigger if stopped by the police. He drove them all the way to Mexico and raped the older girl in a hotel near the border. He released them a few days later, telling them that if they disclosed any details of events, their parents would be killed. Under normal questioning by police, neither girl could remember much of use. The older girl did identify the motel room and the false name the man had given at reception, but these clues didn't turn out to be useful. Then the police tried hypnosis on the older girl. Under hypnosis, she was able to recall unique rust spots on the car, as well as details about things inside the car and parts of the car. For example, she remembered that the gear lever was held in place by tissue paper, and the passenger window made a noise when it was rolled up the last few inches. She was also able to remember a transaction at a San Diego petrol station on a hilltop where the man had the car repaired. She remembered conversations between the man and the mechanic, and that he had paid for the repairs using a credit card. The FBI agents managed to locate the garage and the mechanic, and they managed to identify the exact credit card transaction. This gave them the man's name and address, and this led to his arrest at his house in Northern California. So, again, the use of forensic hypnosis proved absolutely crucial in capturing the suspect, in a case where all other leads had come to nothing. So, it's not hard to see why, on the basis of anecdotal evidence like this, some police forces have been enthusiastic in the use of hypnosis. In the US, some detectives are even trained to carry out the hypnosis themselves. This all sounds great, but unfortunately this is one example of a situation in which anecdotal evidence and scientific research don't tell us the same story. With a few exceptions, most laboratory studies of hypnosis have not been successful in demonstrating the effectiveness of hypnosis in improving memory recall. Some have argued that this is because the laboratory conditions used in most scientific studies were not realistic enough. For example, they weren't realistically stressful. But even studies that have used very realistic situations, for example, where participants believed the crime they saw was genuine, these studies found no advantage of hypnosis. But if this is the case, why do we get all of the compelling anecdotal reports that forensic hypnosis works? Marilyn Smith raised one possibility, which is that while under hypnosis, people's suggestibility is increased. This means people's threshold for what they consider to be a genuine memory changes. This may indeed increase the number of correct memories recalled, but it will also increase the number of false memories recalled. We can represent this using a contingency table, which shows the 4 possible outcomes in a situation when an eyewitness attempts to recall some detail about the crime. So, the eyewitness can correctly remember a detail about the crime, and that would be a correct hit. They can also correctly reject that detail about the crime as being incorrect, so that is, they are sufficiently unsure about the detail to decide that it probably isn't correct. Both of these are good outcomes. However, things can go wrong in 2 ways. First, we can have a false rejection. This is where the detail itself is correct, but the eyewitness rejects it as being a real memory. Then we have false positives, which is where the eyewitness incorrectly recalls the detail as being correct, when in fact it's incorrect. So, changing the threshold for what people consider to be a correct memory shifts things upwards from the bottom row, where the detail is rejected as being untrue, to the top row, where the detail is accepted as being true. So the argument is that hypnosis is shifting things up, regardless of whether they are true or not. So this is great if the detail happens to be correct, but a real problem if the detail happens not to be correct. That is, overall accuracy may not be improved, even though it might appear to be, if we ignore the cases when forensic hypnosis has resulted in people reporting false memories. This is essentially what we are doing when we refer to the anecdotal evidence of it working, where the incidents are far more likely to become anecdotes if the hypnosis results in a positive outcome than if it results in a false positive, which frankly don't make such good stories. Research by Elizabeth Loftus's team found that you can get a similar effect to hypnosis by just asking people to guess when they are uncertain about a memory judgment. That is, you're effectively asking them to lower their threshold of certainty for what they report as being a correct memory. If they're doubtful about a memory, then they should err on the side of assuming it's true. What they found was that people who were asked to guess were more confident of the truth of their false guesses in a later test of their memory, even when they were initially unsure. That is, the very act of guessing had the effect of cementing that false memory as being true. However, this doesn't mean we want to write off hypnosis, just that we need to be careful in how it's used. That is, it may be a good idea as a way of generating leads in investigations where no other leads are forthcoming, which is exactly what we saw in those 2 anecdotes. That is, we want to know about anything the eyewitness can tell us, even if they're uncertain about it, and we acknowledge that there's a high chance of it being inaccurate information. However, in terms of being evidence in its own right, we need to be suspicious of memories generated under hypnosis, as there's a good chance that information generated this way won't be true. So, it's still not quite what we want in terms of improving eyewitness memory. However, another way of looking at this is to see if there's any element of forensic hypnosis that we can leverage to improve memory without risking lots of false information. That is, Does hypnosis give us clues that we can extract and use to create more effective memory enhancement interventions? For a start, is it really the case that all there is to the alleged improved memory generated by forensic hypnosis is that all just down to threshold changes for memory acceptance, or might there be more to it? Well, one other suggestion for how hypnosis might potentially be aiding memory in some cases is that it is reinstating the context of the crime. In a great experiment by Carol Crafton and Stephen Penrod of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, they examined whether context reinstatement without hypnosis improved eyewitness memory. An experimenter, posing as a customer, turned up at a convenience store. He bought a can of drink using a $10 traveller's check, producing 2 forms of ID. He then had a brief chat with the shop assistant and then he left. The first researcher gave a description of the shop assistant to a second researcher. Either 2 or 24 hours later, the second researcher went and found the shop assistant. He told him that he was a law intern and he said, "I'm trying to identify a man who may have been in your store in the last 24 hours. If so, he probably bought something small and paid for it with a $10 traveller's check." The researcher then produced 6 photos and said that the man might be one of them. Half the time he was not one of the 6 photos, half the time he was. They repeated this procedure for 98 shop assistants and ended up with 85 people they were able to use in the study. Half the time, the second experimenter tried to get participants to reinstate the context. He asked the shop assistants to try and remember what had happened during the transaction. He also produced one of the non-photo forms of ID used. What they found was that the act of reinstating the context of the shop assistant's interaction with the customer dramatically improved the identification accuracy of the customer without increasing the number of false identifications too much. So finally, we've got something, an intervention that we could potentially leverage to improve eyewitness memory. Of course, what's needed now is to find a way of turning this and other findings from psychological research into practical techniques that can be used during police investigations. And that's what I'll be talking about in the next presentation.